In the time when the moon rose full and golden over the ancient city of Xianying, when the Wei River flowed like liquid silk beneath wooden bridges worn smooth by countless footsteps, there lived a river trader named Chen Wei. His story unfolds like the gentle current of the river itself, carrying us back through the mists of time to an era when the Qin dynasty was transforming the face of China, uniting disparate kingdoms under heaven's mandate. The morning air in Xianying always carried a particular quality, cool and crisp in the early hours before dawn, scented with the smoke from 10,000 cooking fires, the earthiness of wet clay from the pottery district, and the ever-present aroma of the river. Chen Wei would rise each day while stars still dotted the purple-black sky, his movements practiced and quiet in the small dwelling he maintained near the wharf district. His home was modest but comfortable, built in the traditional style with rammed earth walls that kept the interior cool in summer and retained warmth during the bitter winter months. The floor was hard-packed earth covered with woven reed mats, and the wooden beams overhead had darkened with age and smoke from the small brazier where he prepared his morning tea. Through the paper windows, the first hints of dawn would filter in, casting everything in a soft, dreamlike glow. Chen Wei had inherited his trade from his father, who had received it from his father before him, a lineage of river traders stretching back 5 generations. The Wei River had been their highway, their provider, their teacher. Each generation had learned to read the river's moods, to understand when the spring floods would come rushing down from the mountains, when the autumn droughts would leave the channel shallow and treacherous with exposed rocks. On this particular morning, as Chen Wei prepared his simple breakfast of millet porridge flavored with preserved vegetables and a touch of fermented bean paste, he could hear the city beginning to stir around him. The night watchmen were making their final rounds, their bronze bells ringing softly to mark the hour. Soon, the great drums atop the city walls would sound, announcing the opening of the gates and the official beginning of the day's business. His boat waited at the dock, a sturdy flat-bottomed vessel of aged pine, its planks sealed with a mixture of tung oil and lime that his grandfather had perfected. The boat was neither large nor particularly impressive, but it was reliable and well-maintained. Every rope was inspected daily, every plank checked for weakness. The single sail, made of closely woven hemp cloth, bore patches from many repairs, each one a memory of storms weathered and challenges overcome. As Chen Wei walked through the narrow streets toward the wharf, his footsteps echoed off the packed earth. The city was built on a grid pattern, ordered by the great first emperor himself, with wide main thoroughfares and narrower residential lanes. The buildings rose 2 and sometimes 3 stories, their tile roofs gleaming with morning dew. Shops were beginning to open, their proprietors rolling up the wooden shutters and setting out their wares. The military presence in Xianying was impossible to ignore. Even in these peaceful morning hours, patrols of soldiers moved through the streets in perfect formation. They wore armor of overlapping leather plates, lacquered black and reinforced with bronze studs. Their weapons, bronze-tipped spears called ji and straight double-edged swords known as jian, caught the early light. The soldiers moved with practiced precision, their training evident in every synchronized step. Chen Wei had grown up with this military presence. The Qin state had always been martial in nature, its power built on disciplined armies and innovative military tactics. The crossbow units, or nu, were particularly feared throughout the land. These weapons could pierce armor at distances that traditional archers could barely reach, and the Qin had standardized their production, ensuring that every bolt would fit every crossbow in their vast arsenal. The impact of this military might on civilian life was complex and multifaceted. On one hand, the armies brought order and protection. The roads were safe from bandits, and trade could flow freely between cities. On the other hand, the constant demands for supplies, the conscription of young men for military service, and the heavy taxes needed to maintain such forces placed considerable burden on ordinary people. At the wharf, Chen Wei found the usual morning gathering of traders, dock workers, and officials. The air was thick with conversation, the dialect of Xianying mixing with the accents of traders from distant provinces. Some spoke of goods, silk from the south, salt from the coast, iron from the mountain mines. Others discussed the weather, reading signs in the flight of birds and the color of clouds on the horizon. Old Master Lu, a trader who had worked the river for 60 years, sat on a wooden crate mending a fishing net. His fingers moved with automatic precision, even as his milky eyes could barely see the work. He had taught Chen Wei many things about the river trade: how to judge the quality of grain by its smell and feel, how to negotiate with suspicious provincial officials, how to read the subtle signs that indicated a customer was prepared to pay a premium price. "The river is restless today," old Lu said without looking up from his work. "Can you feel it, young Chen? There's change in the water." Chen Wei paused, extending his senses toward the river. Indeed, there was something different in its flow, though he couldn't quite identify what. The water moved with its usual steady current, but there seemed to be an underlying tension, like a held breath before a sigh. "Perhaps rain in the mountains," Chen Wei suggested, though the sky showed no signs of storms. Old Lu shook his head slowly. "Not weather. Something else. In my years, I've learned that rivers know things before men do. They carry news in their currents: wars beginning, dynasties ending, the rise and fall of great houses. This river has seen the Qin grow from a frontier state to the master of all under heaven. It remembers when Xianying was just a military outpost, before it became the capital of the unified realm." The old man's words carried the weight of experience, and Chen Wei filed them away in his memory. He had learned to trust the instincts of those who had survived decades in the trading life. It was a profession that required not just knowledge of goods and prices, but an almost mystical understanding of patterns and portents. As the sun climbed higher, painting the river in shades of gold and amber, Chen Wei prepared his boat for the day's journey. He was carrying a mixed cargo today: ceramic vessels from the famous kilns of Xianying, carefully packed in straw and secured in the boat's hold, bolts of hemp cloth dyed in the deep indigo that was currently fashionable among provincial administrators, and several sealed jars of fermented grain liquor, a specialty of the capital that commanded high prices in the downstream markets. The loading process was careful and methodical. Weight distribution in a river boat was crucial: too much weight forward and the bow would dig into the water, making steering difficult; too much aft and the boat would be sluggish and hard to control in swift currents. Chen Wei supervised personally, his experienced eye judging each placement. As he worked, a unit of soldiers marched past on the stone quay, their armor clanking rhythmically. They were new recruits by the look of them, farm boys from the countryside being taken to the training grounds outside the city. Their faces showed a mixture of pride and apprehension. Military service in the Qin army was both an honor and a hardship. The training was notoriously rigorous, designed to transform individual farmers into components of an unstoppable military machine. The Qin military doctrine emphasized standardization and discipline above all else. Every soldier learned the same 17 basic combat movements. Every unit drilled in the same formations. Commands were standardized across the entire army, so that a soldier from the far western frontier could seamlessly integrate with a unit from the eastern coast. This standardization extended to weapons and equipment as well. Arrow tips, sword blades, and spear points were manufactured to exact specifications, allowing for easy replacement and repair in the field. Chen Wei had once witnessed a military demonstration during a festival. 1,000 soldiers had moved as one entity, their spears rising and falling in perfect unison, their shields locking together to form an impenetrable wall. The display of coordinated power was both beautiful and terrifying. He understood why enemies of the Qin feared facing such forces in battle. But the military life was not all glory and pageantry. Chen Wei had transported supplies to military camps along the river, and he had seen the reality of a soldier's existence. The camps were orderly but austere, with soldiers sleeping in simple tents or barracks, 8 men to a unit. They ate twice a day, morning and evening, with meals consisting mainly of millet, beans, and preserved vegetables, with meat only on special occasions or after victories. The daily routine in these camps was relentless. Soldiers rose before dawn for physical training, running, weapons practice, and formation drills. The morning was spent in tactical exercises, learning to respond instantly to flag signals and drum commands. Afternoons might include maintaining equipment, building fortifications, or studying military texts. Even in peacetime, the army maintained a state of constant readiness. Chen Wei had befriended some of the quartermasters who managed these camps, and they had shared stories of campaign life. When the army marched, it moved like a city on the move. Thousands of soldiers, hundreds of supply wagons, herds of oxen and horses, all proceeding in carefully orchestrated order. The logistics of feeding, supplying, and managing such a force were staggering. Every bushel of grain, every bundle of arrows, every replacement sandal had to be accounted for and distributed. The impact of military campaigns on civilian populations was profound. When an army passed through a region, it required provisions, grain from the harvests, animals for meat and transport, cloth for uniforms and bandages. While the military paid for these supplies, the prices were fixed by military administrators, often below market rates. Villages near major military routes learned to hide their surpluses, keeping secret stores buried or hidden in forest caches. Yet for all the burdens, many civilians took pride in supporting the military. The Qin armies had ended centuries of warfare between competing states, bringing a peace that, while sometimes harsh, allowed trade and agriculture to flourish. Chen Wei himself had benefited from this stability. In his grandfather's time, river traders had to navigate not just physical hazards but political boundaries, paying tolls and bribes at every border, always at risk from the private armies of local warlords. Now, under the unified Qin administration, a single travel document allowed passage throughout the empire. The standardized currency, round coins with square holes that could be strung together, was accepted everywhere. Even the writing system had been standardized, allowing traders to communicate across dialect barriers through written characters. As Chen Wei cast off from the dock, using a long bamboo pole to push his boat into the current, he reflected on these changes. The river itself seemed unchanged, the same muddy brown water, the same willows trailing their branches along the banks, the same herons standing motionless in the shallows, waiting for unwary fish. But everything human along its course had been transformed. The journey downstream would take him through several market towns before reaching his destination at the confluence where the Wei River met the Yellow River. It was a route he had traveled hundreds of times, yet each journey brought its own challenges and discoveries. The river was never exactly the same twice, sandbars shifted, channels that were deep one season might be shallow the next, and the moods of officials at checkpoints could vary wildly depending on recent news from the capital. As the boat caught the current and began to move with purpose, Chen Wei adjusted the sail to catch the morning breeze. The hemp cloth bellied out with a satisfying snap, and the boat's speed increased. Behind him, Xianying grew smaller, its great walls and towers becoming a jagged line against the horizon. Smoke from the city's countless fires rose in pillars that merged into a general haze, like incense offered to the ancestors. The river carried many vessels besides his own. Fishing boats worked the eddies near the shore, their crews casting weighted nets and practiced arcs. Ferries moved back and forth across the river's width, carrying passengers and livestock. Larger cargo vessels, some pulled by crews of 6 or 8 men, transported bulk goods, grain, coal, building timber. Military supply barges, marked with official pennants, moved with authority through the traffic, other boats yielding right-of-way. Each type of vessel had its own character and purpose. The fishing boats were nimble and shallow-drafted, able to navigate in barely a foot of water. The ferries were broad and stable, designed to remain steady even when loaded with nervous animals. The cargo vessels were sturdy and capacious, built to carry maximum loads with minimum crew. And the military barges were fortified, with raised sides that could provide cover in case of attack, though such attacks were rare in these pacified times. Chen Wei's boat fell somewhere in the middle of this hierarchy, large enough to carry profitable cargo, small enough to be managed by a single person when necessary, though he often hired day laborers for loading and unloading. It was this flexibility that had allowed his family to prosper over the generations, adapting to changing circumstances while others, locked into rigid business models, had failed. As the sun reached its zenith, Chen Wei guided his boat toward a small inlet he knew well, a place where a spring-fed stream joined the main river. Here the water was clear and cool, and ancient trees provided shade. It was time for the midday rest, a tradition among river traders that served both practical and spiritual purposes. He secured the boat to a weathered post that had probably been there since his grandfather's time, its wood worn smooth by countless ropes. The ritual of the midday meal was simple but satisfying: cold millet cakes wrapped in bamboo leaves, pickled vegetables that provided a sharp contrast to the bland grain, and clear water from the spring. As he ate, he observed the life of the river around him. A kingfisher dove from an overhanging branch, emerging with a silver fish writhing in its beak. Dragonflies danced above the water's surface, their wings catching the light like tiny shards of jade. In the mud along the bank, he could see the tracks of various animals that came to drink: deer, wild pigs, and the occasional tiger, though these great cats were becoming rarer as the human population expanded. It was during this peaceful interlude that Chen Wei first noticed the boats. 3 large vessels moving in formation, their sails bearing an unfamiliar mark, a stylized phoenix in red on white cloth. They moved with purpose and efficiency, their crews working in coordinated precision that spoke of careful training and substantial resources. As they passed, Chen Wei could see their cargo: massive quantities of grain in standardized containers, fine textiles protected by waterproof coverings, and what appeared to be metal goods, possibly weapons or tools. The boats themselves were new, their timber fresh and unmarked by the wear that characterized most river vessels. Someone with significant capital had entered the river trade. Over the following weeks, Chen Wei encountered these boats more frequently. They appeared at every major trading post, their representatives making deals with an aggressiveness that disrupted long-standing relationships. Where Chen Wei might negotiate for an hour to achieve a fair price, these new traders would simply offer rates that undercut everyone else, accepting losses that would bankrupt a traditional trader. The owner of this new enterprise was a mystery. Some said it was a retired general using his accumulated wealth to dominate civilian commerce. Others whispered about connections to the imperial court, suggesting that someone in the emperor's inner circle was secretly backing the operation. The truth, when Chen Wei finally learned it, was both simpler and more complex. The man behind the phoenix-marked boats was named Zhang Quan, and he represented a new kind of merchant, one who understood that in the unified Qin state, commercial success required not just capital and connections, but a systematic approach that mirrored military organization. Zhang Quan had studied the Qin military's methods and applied them to trade, creating what he called a commercial army. Chen Wei first met Zhang Quan at the market town of Hadong, a prosperous settlement that had grown around a bridge crossing. The town was bustling with activity when Chen Wei arrived in the late afternoon, the air filled with the sounds of commerce, merchants calling their wares, customers haggling over prices, animals complaining about their circumstances. The dock area was more crowded than usual, and Chen Wei had to wait for a berthing spot. As he maneuvered his boat into position, he noticed that 3 of the prime spots were occupied by the Phoenix-marked vessels. Their crews were unloading with mechanical efficiency, each man knowing exactly his role, no wasted motion or confusion. At the market grounds, Chen Wei set up his modest display, samples of his ceramics arranged on a worn but clean cloth, the indigo fabric draped to show its rich color, one jar of liquor open to allow potential customers to sample its quality. It was a presentation that had served his family well for generations, relying on the quality of the goods to speak for themselves. Zhang Quan's operation, by contrast, was a spectacle. They had erected a temporary pavilion, complete with silk banners and musicians. Beautiful young women in elegant robes served tea to prospective customers while smooth-talking salesmen extolled the virtues of their products. The contrast with Chen Wei's simple setup was stark and, he had to admit, somewhat humiliating. It was near sunset when Zhang Quan himself appeared at Chen Wei's modest stall. He was younger than Chen Wei had expected, perhaps 35 years, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. His robes were of finest silk, but cut in a practical style that suggested he was not merely a figurehead but actively involved in his business operations. "Master Chen," Zhang Quan said, offering a polite bow that was precisely calibrated, respectful but not deferential. "I have heard much about you. They say your family has worked this river for 5 generations. Chen Wei returned the bow, matching its depth exactly. "You honor me with your attention, Master Zhang. Your enterprise has certainly made an impression on the river trade." Zhang Quan smiled, an expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. "The times are changing, Master Chen. The unification has created opportunities for those with vision and resources. The old ways, while admirable in their tradition, may not be sufficient for the new world being built. The river has not changed, Chen Wei replied carefully. It still flows from mountain to sea, caring nothing for empires or commercial innovations. True, Zhang Quan conceded. But the people along the river have changed. They want more than just basic goods now. They want selection, convenience, reliability. My organization can provide all three at scales that individual traders cannot match. The conversation that followed was polite but laden with subtext. Zhang Quan spoke of efficiency, standardization, and economies of scale, concepts borrowed from military logistics and applied to commerce. He described warehouses at strategic points along the river, allowing his boats to reload without returning to Xianyang. He had negotiated exclusive contracts with major producers, cutting out smaller traders entirely. I admire what your family has built, Zhang Quan said finally. In fact, I would like to make you an offer. Join my organization. Your knowledge of the river, your relationships with long-standing customers, these have value. You would be well compensated, and you would no longer bear the risks of independent trading. Chen Wei was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun sink toward the western horizon, painting the river in shades of copper and bronze. His grandfather would have dismissed such an offer immediately, viewing it as a surrender of independence and family honor. But Chen Wei had to admit that the logic of Zhang Quan's position was strong. How long could individual traders survive against such organized competition? I thank you for your generous offer, Chen Wei said at last. But I must decline. My family's tradition is not merely a business but a way of life. To abandon it would be to lose something essential, something that cannot be measured in coins or bolts of silk. Zhang Quan nodded, seemingly unsurprised. I expected as much. Your reputation for integrity precedes you. But consider this, integrity without survival is merely a memory. The world is changing, Master Chen. Those who do not adapt will be overwhelmed. After Zhang Quan departed, Chen Wei sat alone as darkness fell over the market town. Oil lamps were being lit throughout the settlement, creating pools of warm light in the gathering dark. The sounds of commerce were giving way to those of evening entertainment, music from tea houses, laughter from wine shops, the distant sound of a storyteller beginning a tale of ancient heroes. The military parallels in Zhang Quan's operation were impossible to ignore. Just as the Qin military had standardized weapons and tactics, Zhang Quan had standardized his trading practices. His employees wore matching tunics, making them instantly recognizable. His boats flew identical flags, creating a brand identity. His prices were fixed across all markets, eliminating the traditional haggling that had characterized river trade for centuries. This standardization extended to the very structure of his organization. Zhang Quan had divided his operation into departments: procurement, transportation, sales, and administration, each with clear hierarchies and responsibilities. It was said that he held morning briefings with his department heads, just as a general might meet with his officers to plan the day's campaign. The impact on traditional traders was devastating. Within months of Zhang Quan's expansion, several long-established trading families had gone out of business. Some, like the Ho family who had specialized in transporting pottery, simply couldn't compete with Zhang Quan's prices. Others found their supplier relationships undermined when Zhang Quan offered exclusive contracts that paid premium prices for entire production runs. Old Master Lu, when Chen Wei consulted him, was philosophical about the situation. I have seen many changes in my years, he said, his blind eyes gazing at something beyond the physical world. When I was young, we feared the raiders who would sweep down from the northern steppes. Then came the wars between the states, when every journey was a gamble with death. Now we have peace, but peace brings its own challenges. What would you do? Chen Wei asked. I would remember that the river is patient, old Lu replied. It does not fight the rocks in its path, it flows around them, over them, or, given time, wears them away. Zhang Quan's commercial army may seem invincible now, but every army has weaknesses. The question is whether you can survive long enough to find them. The autumn months brought a peculiar beauty to the river valley. The leaves of the willow trees turned gold, creating reflected light that danced on the water's surface. The rice fields along the banks displayed their harvest colors, deep amber and rich brown, while farmers worked with rhythmic precision to bring in the grain before the rains came. Chen Wei adapted his trading patterns to avoid direct competition with Zhang Quan's operation. Where the commercial army focused on high-volume goods and major markets, Chen Wei began to specialize in smaller settlements and unique products that required personal relationships and specialized knowledge. In the mountain village of Qingshan, accessible only by navigating a treacherous series of rapids, Chen Wei found a master craftsman who produced exquisite jade ornaments. The journey was dangerous, several boats had been wrecked attempting it, but Chen Wei had learned the secret from his father. The safe passage required waiting for exactly the right water level, reading subtle signs in the current's behavior, and knowing which rocks were submerged markers rather than hazards. The craftsman, Master Yun, was elderly and particular about whom he would sell to. He had turned away Zhang Quan's representatives, viewing their commercial approach as disrespectful to his art. But Chen Wei he welcomed, recognizing a kindred spirit who understood that some things transcended mere commerce. Each piece tells a story, Master Yun explained, holding up a jade pendant carved in the shape of a dragon. This stone came from the White Mountain, carried down by spring floods 50 years ago. I have been working it for 3 months, finding the form that was always hidden within. Such work cannot be rushed or standardized. Chen Wei paid fair prices for Master Yun's work, knowing he could sell it to collectors in Xianying who valued authenticity and craftsmanship over mass production. It was a small market, but a profitable one, and most importantly, one that Zhang Quan's operation couldn't easily penetrate. Similar opportunities existed throughout the river valley. In the silk-producing town of Mulberry Bend, Chen Wei found a family that had been raising silkworms for 8 generations. Their output was small, but the quality was exceptional, silk so fine it was said to be lighter than mist. The imperial court had once sourced silk from this family, though that relationship had ended with the change in Dynasty. The matriarch of the family, Grandmother Zhou, was nearly 90 years old but still supervised every aspect of production. She showed Chen Wei the mulberry groves where the silkworms fed, the carefully controlled buildings where they spun their cocoons, and the workshops where skilled women unwound the silk with fingers so sensitive they could detect imperfections invisible to the eye. The new traders want us to increase production, Grandmother Zhou said with disdain. They say we could triple our output with modern methods. But what would be the point? We would produce more silk, yes, but it would not be our silk. It would be merely thread, without the soul that comes from patience and care. Chen Wei understood this philosophy deeply. His own family had maintained similar standards, choosing quality over quantity, relationships over transactions. It was an older way of doing business, one that seemed increasingly obsolete in the standardized world the Qin were creating. Yet there remained those who valued such approaches, who understood that efficiency was not the only measure of worth. The military camps along the river provided another niche market. While Zhang Quan's operation handled bulk supplies, grain, cloth, basic equipment, Chen Wei found opportunities in specialty items. Officers, unlike common soldiers, had personal funds and particular tastes. They wanted quality wine for their private dinners, fine ink and paper for their correspondence, small luxuries that reminded them of civilian life. Captain Lin, stationed at the frontier fort of River's End, became a regular customer. He was a career soldier, risen from the ranks through merit rather than family connections, and he had an appreciation for quality that transcended social class. Chen Wei would bring him books, copies of military classics like Sun Tzu's Art of War, but also poetry collections and philosophical texts that were technically discouraged but widely read among educated officers. The army teaches us to be weapons, Captain Lin once confided, sharing a jar of Chen Wei's finest liquor as they watched the sun set over the river. But a weapon without a mind is just a tool. The best officers understand that warfare is as much about understanding human nature as it is about tactics and logistics. The captain shared stories of campaign life that gave Chen Wei deeper insight into the military world. He described the great campaigns of unification, when Qin armies had swept across the land like a tide. The battles had been brutal but brief, Qin discipline and superior logistics overwhelming enemies who still fought in the old style, as individual heroes rather than coordinated units. The key to our success, Captain Lin explained, was not superior courage or even superior weapons. It was organization. Every soldier knew his place, his duty, his role in the greater mechanism. 10,000 individuals became a single entity with a unified purpose. Your competitor, this Zhang Quan, seems to understand this principle. Chen Wei nodded thoughtfully. Yet you choose to buy from me, not from his representatives. The captain smiled. Because I also understand the limitations of such systems. They excel at achieving defined objectives efficiently, but they struggle with nuance, with the unexpected, with the human elements that cannot be standardized. You provide something his organization cannot: genuine human connection, flexibility, understanding of individual needs. This insight proved valuable as Chen Wei navigated the increasingly challenging business environment. He began to focus not just on what he sold but on how he sold it, emphasizing the personal service and deep knowledge that no standardized operation could match. When the daughter of a wealthy merchant in Xianying was to be married, Chen Wei didn't just supply goods for the wedding, he consulted on traditions, suggested auspicious combinations of colors and symbols, and shared stories about the origins and meanings of various customs. Zhang Quan's operation could have provided the same goods at lower prices, but they couldn't provide the cultural knowledge and personal attention that made the event meaningful. Winter came early that year, the first snows dusting the mountains while the leaves still clung to the valley trees. The river ran low and cold, its muddy waters taking on a grayish cast that reflected the overcast skies. Trade always slowed during winter, but this year brought additional challenges. Zhang Quan announced what he called his winter campaign, an aggressive expansion that would establish permanent trading posts in every major town along the river. The infrastructure investment was massive, requiring resources that suggested backing from the highest levels of government or possibly even the imperial treasury itself. The trading posts were more than simple warehouses. They were fortified compounds with living quarters for staff, storage facilities for goods, and even small garrisons of private guards, former soldiers hired to protect Zhang Quan's interests. The message was clear: this was not temporary competition but a permanent transformation of the river trade. Chen Wei watched the construction of the Xianying trading post from his small dwelling. The compound rose like a military fort, with high walls and watchtowers. Workers labored day and night, their activities illuminated by great bonfires that sent smoke plumes into the winter sky. The efficiency was remarkable. What would have taken traditional builders months was completed in weeks. The impact on small traders was immediate and harsh. The Wang family, who had run a modest trading operation for 3 generations, announced they were closing their business. The younger Liu brothers, who had specialized in transporting salt from the coastal regions, sold their boats to Zhang Quan's operation for a fraction of their value. Even old Master Liu, despite his decades of experience, admitted that he was considering retirement. "The river has carried many things in my lifetime," he said one cold morning, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "I have seen bodies float past from upstream battles, watched treasure barges carry wealth beyond imagining, observed the slow movement of refugees fleeing war or famine. But I have never seen the river itself conquered, and that is what this feels like, a conquest not of land but of livelihood." Chen Wei's own situation grew increasingly precarious. His regular customers were being systematically approached by Zhang Quan's sales representatives, offered prices and terms that Chen Wei couldn't match. Some remained loyal out of personal affection or respect for tradition, but Chen Wei couldn't blame those who switched. Times were hard, and survival often required practical rather than sentimental choices. It was during this difficult period that Chen Wei received an unexpected visitor. On a particularly cold evening, with snow falling thick and silent outside, a knock came at his door. When he opened it, he found a young woman in traveling clothes, her face partially hidden by a fur-lined hood. "Master Chen," she asked, her voice cultured despite her modest appearance. "I am Song Mei. I represent certain interests that have been observing the changes in the river trade with concern." Chen Wei invited her in, offering tea and a seat by the brazier. As she warmed herself, she revealed more about her purpose. She represented a coalition of traditional merchant families from across the empire, all facing similar challenges from organized commercial operations like Zhang Quan's. "We are not opposing progress," Song Mei explained. "We understand that the unification has changed the rules of commerce. But we believe there is value in preserving traditional methods alongside new innovations. Diversity in trade, like diversity in nature, creates resilience." The coalition she represented proposed a different model, a loose confederation of independent traders who would share information, coordinate when beneficial, but maintain their individual character and methods. It was not an attempt to match Zhang Quan's centralized efficiency but rather to create an alternative that emphasized different values. "Think of it as the difference between a disciplined army and a network of guerrilla fighters," Song Mei said, using a military metaphor that Chen Wei found apparent. "We cannot defeat them in direct confrontation, but we can survive and even thrive by being what they cannot be: flexible, personal, deeply rooted in local communities." Chen Wei considered the proposal carefully. Joining such a coalition would mean abandoning the complete independence his family had always maintained. But the alternative seemed to be eventual elimination from the trade altogether. Before he could make a decision, events took an unexpected turn. A severe winter storm, the worst in living memory, struck the river valley. The snow fell for 3 days and nights without pause, accumulating to depths that made roads impassable and threatened to collapse roofs. The river itself began to freeze, something that happened perhaps once in a generation. Zhang Quan's trading posts, for all their impressive construction, were not prepared for such extreme weather. Their supply chains, optimized for efficiency under normal conditions, broke down when faced with extraordinary circumstances. Boats trapped in ice couldn't deliver goods. Warehouses designed for rapid turnover couldn't accommodate extended storage. Staff accustomed to routine operations struggled with emergency conditions. Chen Wei, by contrast, had learned from his father and grandfather how to prepare for extreme weather. His boat was already in winter storage, properly maintained and protected. His goods were cached in various secure locations, not concentrated in a single vulnerable warehouse. Most importantly, he had relationships with local suppliers who could provide necessities even when transportation networks failed. As the storm continued, Chen Wei found himself in an unexpected position. Wealthy customers who had switched to Zhang Quan's operation discovered that efficiency meant nothing when goods couldn't be delivered. They came to Chen Wei, sometimes trudging through snow drifts, seeking basic supplies: lamp oil, preserved foods, charcoal for heating. Chen Wei could have exploited the situation, charging premium prices as supply and demand would justify. Instead, he sold at fair rates, sometimes extending credit to those in genuine need. It was not just ethical business practice but strategic thinking. Every transaction during the crisis was building relationships that would endure long after the snow melted. Captain Lin, whose garrison was cut off from regular supplies, sent a message requesting assistance. Chen Wei organized a small convoy of locals, loading sledges with grain and preserved vegetables, and made the treacherous journey to the frontier fort. The soldiers, accustomed to the reliability of Zhang Quan's military-style supply system, were genuinely grateful for the help from a traditional trader. "This reminds me of something my old commander used to say," Captain Lin told Chen Wei as they shared a simple meal in the garrison. He said that in war, the side with the better system usually wins, but sometimes the system fails, and then it's the side with better people that prevails. When spring finally came, it arrived with dramatic force. The accumulated snow in the mountains melted rapidly, sending torrents of water rushing down into the river valley. The Wei River, which had been a frozen highway just weeks before, became a raging brown monster, its waters rising far above normal levels. The flooding was severe but not unprecedented. Chen Wei's family records, carefully maintained over generations, documented similar events. His great-grandfather had marked high water lines on rocks and buildings, creating a historical record that allowed prediction and preparation. Chen Wei had moved his goods to high ground well before the waters rose, and his boat was secured in a protected inlet where the current couldn't reach it. Zhang Quan's operation, despite its resources, struggled with the flooding. Their trading posts, built for efficiency rather than flood resistance, suffered significant damage. Several of their boats, moored in what seemed like safe locations based on recent experience rather than generational knowledge, were swept away by the current. The standardized procedures that worked so well under normal conditions proved inadequate when facing natural forces that operated outside commercial logic. It was during this period of natural upheaval that the true nature of Zhang Quan's backing was revealed. Chen Wei, who had remained in Xianying through the winter, brought Chen Wei disturbing news. Through her network's investigations, they had discovered that Zhang Quan's operation was not merely backed by wealthy investors or government officials. It was a direct extension of military logistics, an experiment in applying military organization to civilian commerce. The idea came from the highest levels, Chen Wei explained. They believe that controlling commerce is as important as controlling territory. If trade can be organized like the army, standardized, hierarchical, responsive to central command, then the empire's economic power can be directed as precisely as its military might. The implications were profound. This was not simply business competition but a fundamental transformation of how the economy would function. If successful, independent traders like Chen Wei would not just be outcompete, they would be obsolete, relics of an older, less efficient system. Yet the spring floods had revealed a crucial weakness in this vision. Military-style organization excelled at achieving defined objectives under predictable conditions. But commerce, like nature itself, was full of uncertainties, local variations, and human peculiarities that resisted standardization. Chen Wei observed this truth playing out in countless small ways. When the floods receded, leaving behind fertile silt that would produce exceptional harvests, local farmers needed seeds and tools immediately. Zhang Quan's operation, following standard procedures, required approval from regional headquarters before adjusting their inventory. By the time approval came, Chen Wei and other traditional traders had already supplied what was needed, accepting barter when farmers lacked ready cash. In the town of Willow Bend, a traditional festival required specific ceremonial items, particular incense, specially prepared rice wine, silk banners and exact shades of red and gold. Zhang Quan's representatives offered similar items at lower prices, but they weren't quite right. The incense was of a different blend, the wine lacked the proper ritual preparation, the silk was the wrong shade of red. Chen Wei, who had supplied these festivals for years, knew exactly what was required. These might seem like small victories, but they illustrated a larger principle. Human society, for all the Qin dynasty's attempts at standardization, remained stubbornly diverse. Regional dialects persisted despite official pronouncements. Local customs endured despite cultural unification efforts. And traditional trade relationships, built on generations of trust and understanding, proved more resilient than anyone had expected. Old Master Lu, who had survived the winter and emerged with renewed vitality in spring, offered his perspective. The emperor can standardize weights and measures, can dictate that all carts have the same axle width, can even decree that all writing use the same characters. But he cannot standardize the human heart, cannot make all needs identical, cannot reduce the complexity of life to military simplicity. As spring progressed into early summer, a new equilibrium began to emerge. Zhang Quan's operation dominated bulk trade and standard goods, their efficiency in these areas undeniable. But traditional traders found niches, specialty products, personal services, local knowledge, that the standardized system couldn't adequately address. Chen Wei adapted his business model to this new reality. He formed the loose alliance with Song Mei's coalition, sharing information and occasionally coordinating activities while maintaining independence. He focused on high-value, low-volume goods that required expertise to evaluate and sell. He cultivated relationships with customers who valued knowledge and service over mere price. One day, while conducting business in a river town, Chen Wei encountered Zhang Quan again. The commercial magnate looked older, the stress of managing his vast operation showing in new lines around his eyes. Master Chen, Zhang Quan greeted him with what seemed like genuine respect. I heard about your assistance during the winter crisis. Your actions brought honor to all traders. We each serve according to our nature, Chen Wei replied carefully. Your methods have their place, as do mine. Zhang Quan was quiet for a moment, watching the river flow past. I sometimes wonder, he said finally, if in creating efficiency we lose something essential. My operation runs like clockwork, each part performing its function perfectly. But clockwork has no heart, no ability to adapt beyond its design. The river teaches patience, Chen Wei offered. It accommodates all vessels, the great and the small, the swift and the slow. There is room for both of us on these waters. Zhang Quan smiled slightly. Perhaps. Though I suspect my backers would disagree. They see your independence as inefficiency to be eliminated. And yet, Chen Wei observed, you needed us during the crisis. Even the most disciplined army requires irregular forces, scouts, foragers, local guides. Perhaps traditional traders serve a similar function in commerce. As autumn returned to the river valley, painting the landscape in shades of gold and rust, Chen Wei reflected on the changes that had transformed his world. The brutal competition that had threatened to destroy traditional trading had instead forced an evolution, creating a more complex commercial ecosystem than anyone had anticipated. The military analogies that had seemed so appropriate now appeared incomplete. Yes, Zhang Quan's operation functioned like an army, but successful armies required more than just disciplined regular forces. They needed intelligence gatherers who could blend with local populations, quartermasters who understood regional resources, diplomats who could navigate cultural differences. Traditional traders, Chen Wei realized, filled these auxiliary roles in the commercial sphere. This understanding was crystallized during an unexpected event, a visit from an imperial inspector investigating complaints about commercial monopolization. The official, a scholar bureaucrat named Magistrate Wu, had been tasked with determining whether Zhang Quan's operation was distorting markets in ways harmful to the empire's interests. Magistrate Wu was a thoughtful man who approached his task with scholarly thoroughness. He interviewed traders, customers, and suppliers. He examined records and observed transactions. Chen Wei spent a full day with him, explaining the intricacies of river trade and the changes recent developments had brought. The question before me, Magistrate Wu mused as they watched the sunset from the riverbank, is whether uniformity serves the empire better than diversity. The military model argues for standardization, one system, perfectly executed. But nature argues for variety, many approaches, each adapted to specific conditions. Chen Wei chose his words carefully. In my experience, magistrate, the river itself provides the best guidance. It follows a general course toward the sea, but it adapts to every obstacle, finds multiple channels through difficult terrain, and nourishes different communities in different ways. The magistrate's report, when it was eventually published, reflected this wisdom. While acknowledging the efficiency gains from operations like Zhang Quan's, it warned against allowing any single entity to dominate commerce completely. It recommended a mixed system, large organized operations handling bulk commodities and standardized goods, while traditional traders maintained their role in specialized markets and local commerce. Zhang Quan's backers were reportedly unhappy with this conclusion, but they couldn't openly oppose an imperial magistrate's findings. The result was an uneasy but functional coexistence. Zhang Quan's operation continued to expand but more slowly and with greater accommodation for traditional traders. Captain Lin, during one of Chen Wei's visits to the frontier garrison, offered a military perspective on the situation. In battle, he said, we learn that rigid formations are powerful but vulnerable. A phalanx can crush infantry but struggles against mounted archers. A cavalry charge devastates open ground but fails in forests. The most successful armies combine different types of forces, each covering the other's weaknesses. And in commerce? Chen Wei asked. The same principle applies. Zhang Quan's commercial army excels at certain missions, moving large quantities efficiently, maintaining consistent supply lines, standardizing quality. But you traditional traders excel at others, adapting to local needs, maintaining cultural traditions, providing personal service. The empire needs both. This ecological view of commerce gradually gained acceptance. Even some of Zhang Quan's lieutenants began to see the value in cooperation rather than complete competition. Informal agreements developed. Zhang Quan's boats would carry Chen Wei's specialty goods when they had spare capacity, while Chen Wei would direct customers seeking bulk commodities to Zhang Quan's trading posts. Song Mei's coalition evolved into a formal guild of traditional traders, providing mutual support while preserving individual independence. They established standards for quality and ethical business practices, created a system for sharing information about conditions along the river, and developed collective responses to crises. The transformation was perhaps best illustrated by what happened in the town of River's Heart during the autumn festival. Zhang Quan's operation provided the bulk supplies: grain for festival meals, cloth for decorations, timber for temporary structures. But traditional traders like Chen Wei supplied the special items: rare incense for temple ceremonies, specific wines for ritual toasts, traditional crafts for gift-giving. The festival itself became a metaphor for the new commercial reality. The efficiency of mass supply created the foundation, but the personality of traditional trade provided the character. Neither alone would have been sufficient. Together they created something richer than either could achieve independently. As winter approached again, Chen Wei found himself in a very different position than the previous year. No longer fighting for mere survival, he had established a sustainable niche in the transformed commercial landscape. His business was smaller than his grandfather's had been, but it was also more specialized, more valued by those who understood quality over quantity. The preparations for winter reflected hard-won wisdom. Chen Wei coordinated with other traditional traders to ensure distributed supplies throughout the river valley. They cached goods in strategic locations, maintained communication networks independent of official channels, and prepared for contingencies that standardized operations might overlook. Zhang Quan, perhaps learning from the previous winter's disasters, consulted with traditional traders about weather patterns and historical precedents. It was a remarkable shift, the commercial army acknowledging the value of generational knowledge and local expertise. One snowy evening, Chen Wei received an unexpected guest. Zhang Quan himself arrived at his modest dwelling, accompanied only by a single bodyguard who waited outside. The commercial magnate looked tired, older, perhaps wiser than when they had first met. "Master Chen," Zhang Quan began after accepting tea, "I have been thinking about our conversation by the river. You spoke of accommodation, of different vessels sharing the water. I dismissed it then as the philosophy of someone unable to compete. I see now it was wisdom I was too proud to recognize." Chen Wei remained silent, allowing his guest to continue. "My backers push always for greater efficiency, more control, complete dominance of trade routes. They see commerce as territory to be conquered, held, exploited. But you cannot conquer a river. You can dam it, redirect it, but ultimately it finds its way." "The river is patient," Chen Wei offered, echoing old Master Lu's wisdom. "Yes," Zhang Quan agreed. "And so, it seems, are traditional traders. I expected you to break, to bend, to join us or be eliminated. Instead, you adapted, survived, even thrived in your own way. You found what we could not provide and made it essential." The conversation that followed was remarkable for its honesty. Zhang Quan revealed the pressures he faced: investors demanding ever greater returns, government officials expecting his operation to serve state purposes, the constant challenge of managing an organization that had grown beyond any single person's ability to control. "I envy you sometimes," Zhang Quan admitted. "Your boat, your goods, your relationships, all within your grasp, all under your direct control. I command a commercial empire, but I am also commanded by it. Every efficiency we create generates new complexities. Every problem we solve reveals three more." Chen Wei considered his words carefully. Perhaps that is the nature of all human endeavors. We seek to impose order on chaos, but chaos always reasserts itself in new forms. The wise person learns to dance with chaos rather than trying to eliminate it. "Is that what you've done? Dance with chaos?" "I've tried to be like water," Chen Wei replied. "Flowing around obstacles rather than confronting them directly, finding the path of least resistance that still leads to my destination." Zhang Quan was quiet for a long moment. Outside, snow continued to fall, muffling the sounds of the city. "There may be changes coming," he said finally. "My backers are reconsidering their approach. The costs of maintaining our operation are enormous, and the returns, while substantial, are not what they projected. They may reduce support, force us to become more conventional." Chen Wei understood the implications. If Zhang Quan's operation lost its special backing, it would have to compete on more equal terms. The playing field might level somewhat, though the changes already made to the river trade were irreversible. "Change is the only constant," Chen Wei observed. "My family has survived 5 generations on this river by accepting change while maintaining our essential nature. Perhaps your organization will need to learn similar adaptability." After Zhang Quan departed, Chen Wei stood at his window watching the snow fall on the sleeping city. The river, invisible in the darkness and snow, continued its eternal flow toward the sea. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new complexities to navigate. But tonight, there was peace. The prophecy of change that Zhang Quan had hinted at came to pass with the spring thaw. News arrived from the capital that the experiment in militarized commerce was being restructured. The official language was bureaucratic and oblique, but the meaning was clear: Zhang Quan's operation would no longer receive special government support. The impact was immediate and dramatic. Without subsidized financing, Zhang Quan's organization couldn't maintain its predatory pricing. Without official backing, it couldn't demand preferential treatment at ports and checkpoints. Without the promise of inevitable dominance, key employees began to leave, some starting their own trading ventures, others joining traditional traders who suddenly needed additional help. Chen Wei watched these developments with mixed feelings. There was no joy in seeing Zhang Quan's empire fragment. Too many livelihoods depended on it, and its complete collapse would create chaos in the river trade. But there was relief that the existential threat to traditional trading was diminishing. Song Mei convened a meeting of the Traditional Traders Coalition to discuss how to respond to the new situation. The gathering took place in a riverside temple, a neutral location that emphasized the spiritual as well as commercial aspects of their profession. "We must be careful," Song Mei counseled. "If we appear to be celebrating Zhang Quan's difficulties, we risk creating new enemies. If we try to exploit the situation too aggressively, we become what we opposed. Our response must be measured, ethical, strategic." The coalition agreed on a series of principles. They would hire former employees of Zhang Quan's operation but wouldn't actively recruit them. They would expand into markets Zhang Quan was abandoning but wouldn't undercut prices below sustainable levels. Most importantly, they would maintain the values that had allowed them to survive: quality, relationship, tradition, adaptability. Old Master Lu, now so elderly he had to be carried to the meeting, offered his final public wisdom. "I have lived through war and peace, feast and famine, the rise and fall of dynasties. The river has been my constant companion, my teacher, my livelihood. It has taught me that nothing is permanent except change itself." Zhang Quan tried to dam the river of commerce, to control its flow completely. But rivers always find a way around dams, through them, over them. We survive not by being stronger than the dam but by being like water, patient, flexible, persistent. His words proved prophetic. Over the following months, the river trade evolved into something new, neither the traditional system that had existed before Zhang Quan nor the militarized commercial empire he had tried to create, but a hybrid that incorporated elements of both. Zhang Quan himself, stripped of his special backing but still possessing considerable resources and expertise, had to adapt to the new reality. Chen Wei encountered him at the summer market in Xianying, where both were conducting business. "Master Chen," Zhang Quan greeted him, his manner less imperious than before. "I find myself in the position of a general without an army, trying to fight with irregular forces. Perhaps," Chen Wei suggested, "it is time to stop thinking in military terms altogether. Commerce is not war, though it can feel like it. At its best, trade creates value for all parties: sellers, buyers, transporters, the communities through which goods flow." Zhang Quan considered this. "You may be right. I was taught to think in terms of victory and defeat, domination and submission. But the river trade seems to resist such binary thinking. The river connects rather than divides, Chen Wei observed. It carries goods downstream and boats return upstream. It's a cycle, not a battle line. This philosophical shift was reflected in practical changes. Zhang Quan reorganized his remaining operation into something more flexible and responsive. He maintained efficient systems for bulk goods where standardization made sense, but he also created space for specialty products and personal service. A symbolic moment came when Zhang Quan asked Chen Wei to transport a particularly valuable cargo, ancient manuscripts being sent to a private library downstream. It was exactly the kind of specialized, high-trust transaction that traditional traders excelled at. "Why me?" Chen Wei asked. "Because," Zhang Quan replied, "you understand that some things cannot be reduced to mere commodities. These manuscripts aren't just old paper and ink, they're wisdom, history, culture. They require a courier who appreciates their true value." The successful delivery of the manuscripts led to other collaborations. Zhang Quan's organization provided warehouse space for traditional traders during peak seasons. Traditional traders shared their knowledge of local conditions and customs with Zhang Quan's younger employees. Competition remained, but it was tempered by mutual respect and occasional cooperation. As summer reached its peak, with the river running steady and strong between banks lined with mature crops, Chen Wei found himself reflecting on the deeper meanings of what had transpired. The brutal competition that had threatened to kill traditional river trading had instead transformed it, forcing evolution and adaptation that ultimately strengthened the entire commercial ecosystem. He shared these thoughts with Captain Lin during a visit to the frontier garrison. The military officer, now nearing retirement himself, had observed the commercial transformation with professional interest. "You know," Captain Lin said, "military theorists often debate whether war is science or art. The Qin military success suggests it's science, standardization, discipline, systematic approaches. But the best commanders know it's also art, reading the enemy, sensing opportunity, adapting to unexpected conditions." "And commerce?" Chen Wei prompted. "The same duality exists. Zhang Quan tried to make it pure science, pure system. You traditional traders treated it as pure art, all relationships and intuition. The truth, as usual, lies between extremes." This balanced perspective was increasingly accepted throughout the river trade community. Schools were established where young traders could learn both traditional knowledge and modern methods. The curriculum included practical skills like navigation and negotiation, but also history, philosophy, and poetry, recognizing that successful traders needed both technical competence and cultural understanding. Chen Wei was invited to teach at one such school, sharing his family's accumulated wisdom with a new generation. His first lecture began with a simple demonstration. He placed two items on the table, a rigid iron rod and a silk ribbon. "Which is stronger?" he asked his students. The obvious answer seemed to be the iron rod, but the students, sensing a lesson, were cautious in their responses. Chen Wei bent the iron rod until it snapped, the sound sharp in the quiet room. Then he pulled the silk ribbon, stretching it, twisting it, but it remained intact. "Rigidity seems strong but breaks under sufficient pressure," he explained. "Flexibility seems weak but survives forces that destroy rigidity. The river trade teaches this lesson daily. Those who cannot bend will break. Those who can adapt will endure." The lessons continued through the seasons, combining practical instruction with philosophical insight. Students learned to read weather signs and human nature with equal attention. They studied account books and poetry with similar dedication. They understood that success in trade required not just moving goods efficiently but understanding the human needs and desires that created demand for those goods. Zhang Quan occasionally guest lectured, sharing his insights on organization and efficiency. His presence in the traditional trading school would have been unthinkable a year earlier, but the transformation of the river trade had transformed its participants as well. "I once believed," Zhang Quan told the students, "that commerce could be perfected through system and control. I now understand that perfection in commerce, as in nature, comes not from uniformity but from balance, efficiency balanced with flexibility, standardization balanced with customization, competition balanced with cooperation. The river itself remained the ultimate teacher. Students spent time on the water, learning its moods and messages. They observed how it carved new channels when old ones were blocked, how it could be gentle or violent depending on conditions, how it connected diverse communities while allowing each to maintain its distinct character. One student asked Chen Wei, "Master, if you could live your life again, would you choose differently? Would you join Zhang Quan's organization when he first offered?" Chen Wei considered the question seriously. Every choice carries both losses and gains. Had I joined Zhang Quan, I might have prospered more in material terms. But I would have lost something irreplaceable, the direct connection to 5 generations of family tradition, the independence to make decisions based on my own judgment, the satisfaction of surviving through my own adaptability rather than organizational power. So you have no regrets? Regret is like trying to flow upstream, exhausting and futile. I made choices based on the understanding I had at the time. That those choices led to struggle but ultimately to survival and even wisdom, this seems to me a good outcome, though perhaps not the one I would have chosen if I could have seen the future. Autumn arrived with its familiar transformation of the landscape, and with it came news that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. The imperial government announced a new commercial policy that formally recognized both large-scale organized trading operations and traditional independent traders as essential components of the empire's economy. The policy document, crafted by Magistrate Wu based on his earlier investigation, used musical metaphors to describe the ideal commercial environment. Just as beautiful music required both rhythm and melody, structure and improvisation, the river trade needed both efficient large-scale operations and adaptive small-scale traders. The announcement was celebrated with a festival in Xianyang, bringing together traders of all types. Zhang Quan and Chen Wei found themselves seated at the same banquet table, a placement that might have been awkward earlier but now seemed natural. To think, Zhang Quan mused, raising his cup in a toast, that we were once enemies, each seeking the other's elimination. Were we enemies, Chen Wei asked, or were we simply playing roles that circumstances demanded? The farmer and the flood seem opposed, but both are part of the river's cycle. Old Master Lu, despite his age and infirmity, had insisted on attending the festival. He sat between them, his blind eyes seeming to see more than those with sight. "You were both teachers to each other," he said, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying remarkable authority. Zhang Quan taught the traditional traders that the old ways alone were not enough, that adaptation and efficiency had value. Chen Wei taught the modernizers that efficiency without humanity is mere mechanism, that tradition carries wisdom that cannot be easily replaced. The old master's words carried special weight because everyone knew this would likely be his last public appearance. Indeed, he would pass away peacefully just weeks later, his funeral attended by hundreds of traders who came to honor not just the man but what he represented, the living bridge between past and future. As the festival continued into the night, with music and storytelling, Chen Wei found himself walking along the riverbank with Song Mei. The coalition organizer had proven instrumental in helping traditional traders survive and adapt. "What do you think comes next?" Song Mei asked, watching lanterns float on the river's dark surface. "More change," Chen Wei replied with certainty. "The empire continues to evolve, and we must evolve with it. But I believe we've learned something valuable, that diversity creates resilience, that competition need not mean elimination, that different approaches can coexist and even strengthen each other." Song Mei nodded. The brutal competition that threatened to kill river trading instead gave it new life, though in a different form than before. Death and rebirth, Chen Wei mused. The river teaches this too. Each spring, snowmelt from the mountains brings flooding that seems destructive but actually renews the soil. What appears to be ending is actually transformation. Their philosophical discussion was interrupted by the arrival of a young trader, one of Chen Wei's recent students, bearing urgent news. A new innovation had arrived from the far western regions, a method of preserving goods that could revolutionize long-distance trade. Chen Wei and Song Mei exchanged knowing looks. Here was the next change, the next challenge, the next opportunity. The cycle continued. Winter came gently that year, with light snows that decorated rather than buried the landscape. Chen Wei, now recognized as one of the senior traditional traders on the river, spent much of his time teaching and mentoring younger traders. His small dwelling had been expanded to include a study where he maintained the family records and wrote his own contributions to the accumulated wisdom. One evening, as he worked by lamplight transcribing old documents onto fresh silk, he was visited by an unexpected guest, a young boy of perhaps 12 years, Zhang Quan's son. "Master Chen," the boy said with a formal bow, "my father sends his respects and asks if you would accept me as a student." Chen Wei was surprised. "Your father has his own organization, his own methods. Why would he want you to learn from a traditional trader?" The boy, clearly intelligent and well-prepared, replied, "My father says that to understand the river trade fully, one must understand both the new ways and the old. He says you are the best teacher of the old ways, and that even the old ways contain seeds of the future." Chen Wei accepted the boy as a student, and this arrangement became symbolic of the new harmony in the river trade. The son of the great modernizer learning from the traditional master, bridging two approaches that had once seemed irreconcilable. The boy proved an eager and capable student. He learned to read the river's signs, to evaluate goods by touch and smell, to sense the human dynamics underlying commercial transactions. But he also brought his own insights, shaped by his father's systematic approaches, creating synthesis between old and new. One day, while teaching the boy to navigate a particularly tricky stretch of river, Chen Wei shared a story from his family's history. "My great-great-grandfather faced a similar challenge to what we recently experienced," he said. "Not from organized competition but from new technology, larger boats that could carry more cargo. Many small traders were driven out of business. But my ancestor adapted, finding goods that required special handling the large boats couldn't provide. The lesson passed down was simple: change is inevitable, but obsolescence is not." The boy absorbed this wisdom thoughtfully. "So the brutal competition with my father's organization was not unique?" "Nothing under heaven is truly unique," Chen Wei replied. "Patterns repeat with variations. The wise person learns to recognize patterns while remaining alert to what makes each situation distinct." As winter deepened, Chen Wei received word that the emperor himself had taken interest in the river trade transformation. An imperial commission was being formed to study how the lessons learned might be applied to other sectors of the economy. Chen Wei was invited to serve on this commission, an honor that would have been unimaginable for a simple river trader in earlier times. The commission meetings took place in the capital, in halls decorated with maps of the empire's vast territories. Officials, scholars, and merchants gathered to discuss how commerce could serve both efficiency and humanity, both progress and tradition. Chen Wei's contributions were valued for their practical wisdom. When discussing the standardization of markets, he advocated for consistency in weights and measures but flexibility in local customs. When examining distribution networks, he emphasized the importance of redundancy, multiple channels that could compensate if one failed. "The river," he told the commission, "does not flow in a single channel but braids and branches, creating multiple paths to its destination. This apparent inefficiency is actually resilience. Commerce should learn from nature's wisdom." His words influenced the final recommendations, which endorsed a mixed economy that valued both large-scale efficiency and small-scale adaptability. The emperor, reviewing these recommendations, reportedly commented that the harmony achieved in the river trade should serve as a model for governance itself, firm structure balanced with flexible response. Returning to Xianying after the commission meetings, Chen Wei found the river trade thriving in its new configuration. Zhang Quan's organization, restructured and more flexible, handled bulk commodities efficiently. Traditional traders, organized through Song Mei's coalition but maintaining independence, served specialized markets and provided local expertise. New traders, trained in both approaches, created innovative combinations. The river itself seemed unchanged, the same muddy waters, the same seasonal rhythms, the same eternal flow toward the sea. But the human activity along its banks had been transformed. Where once there had been desperate competition threatening extinction, there was now dynamic balance creating prosperity. As spring came round again, Chen Wei stood at the prow of his boat, now accompanied by young Zhang, as the boy had come to be known, and 2 other students. They were embarking on a trading journey that would take them the full length of the river, from the mountains to the sea, a ceremonial voyage that had become an annual tradition, celebrating the survival and transformation of river trading. The boat was loaded with symbolic cargo, goods from every major trading post along the river, representing the interconnected nature of commerce. There were jade ornaments from Master Yun's mountain workshop, silk from Grandmother Zhou's family operation, pottery from Xianying's kilns, grain from the fertile middle valleys, and salt from the coastal regions. At each stop, they were greeted by traders who had survived the brutal competition and emerged transformed. Stories were shared, lessons exchanged, and bonds renewed. The journey became a living chronicle of adaptation and survival. In the town of River's Heart, they met a former captain from Zhang Quan's organization who had started his own small trading company. He had taken the organizational skills learned in the commercial army and applied them at a human scale, creating an operation that was efficient but personal. "I learned from both failures," he told Chen Wei. "The failure of pure tradition to adapt quickly enough, and the failure of pure system to accommodate human complexity. My approach seeks the middle way." Further downstream, in Willow Bend, they encountered a collective of women traders who had emerged during the chaos of competition. When traditional family operations had struggled and Zhang Quan's organization had focused on male employees, these women had found opportunity in the gap, specializing in textiles and household goods that required aesthetic judgment and cultural sensitivity. Their leader, Madame Su, explained their philosophy. "We saw that both traditional and modern approaches were dominated by male perspectives. We brought something different: attention to domestic needs, understanding of seasonal fashion changes, networks based on kinship rather than just commerce." The brutal competition created space for new voices. Young Zhang absorbed all these lessons with remarkable intensity. Chen Wei could see in him the potential for a new generation of traders who would naturally integrate what previous generations had seen as opposites. One evening, as they camped on a riverbank under a vast canopy of stars, young Zhang asked a profound question: "Master Chen, was the brutal competition necessary? Could the river trade have evolved without that crisis?" Chen Wei considered carefully before answering. Change was necessary. The old ways alone could not meet the needs of a unified empire. Whether it required such brutal competition, perhaps not. But humans rarely change willingly. We are like water that follows established channels until forced to find new paths. The competition was the flood that forced us to find those new paths. So suffering was necessary? "Suffering is a teacher," Chen Wei replied, "though not the only one. We could perhaps have learned the same lessons through gradual adaptation, but that would have required wisdom we didn't possess. Sometimes crisis reveals wisdom that comfort conceals." As their journey continued toward the sea, the river grew wider and more powerful. Other streams and tributaries joined it, each adding their waters to the greater flow. It seemed a perfect metaphor for how the river trade had evolved, not a single channel but many streams combining into something greater than any individual part. Near the coast, they encountered sea traders who connected the river commerce to maritime routes reaching distant lands. These traders spoke of goods and ideas from beyond the empire: spices, precious stones, philosophical texts, and technological innovations. "The river trade you've transformed," one sea captain told Chen Wei, "serves as a model for international commerce. The balance you've achieved between efficiency and humanity, standardization and flexibility, is being studied in distant ports." Chen Wei felt both pride and humility at such words. The struggle for survival had created something of value beyond mere commercial success, a model for how different approaches could coexist and strengthen each other. On the return journey to Xianying, traveling upstream against the current, Chen Wei had time to reflect on all that had transpired. The brutal competition that killed river trader had not killed river trading, it had killed a certain version of it, allowing rebirth in a new form. He thought of old Master Lu, now resting in the ancestral grounds, whose patient wisdom had guided so many through the crisis. He thought of Zhang Quan, whose aggressive challenge had forced necessary adaptation. He thought of Chen Wei, whose organizational skills had helped traditional traders survive and thrive. Each had played an essential role in the transformation. As Xianying came into view, its walls and towers familiar yet somehow different through experienced eyes, Chen Wei realized that his own transformation had been as profound as that of the river trade itself. He had begun as a simple trader, concerned primarily with maintaining family tradition and earning a living. He had become a teacher, a philosopher of commerce, a bridge between old and new. Young Zhang, standing beside him at the boat's prow, represented the future, trained in traditional wisdom but comfortable with modern methods, seeing not opposition but complementarity in different approaches. Master Chen, young Zhang said, when I complete my training, I hope to establish a trading house that honors both my father's innovations and your traditions. Would such an enterprise have your blessing? Chen Wei smiled, seeing in the boy's earnest face the continuation of a story that had begun with his own ancestors 5 generations ago. The river blesses all vessels that respect its nature, he said. Your enterprise will succeed if it remembers that commerce serves people, not the reverse. As they docked at the familiar wharf, Chen Wei saw that the waterfront had changed. Where once there had been clear divisions between traditional traders' modest docks and Zhang Quan's fortified compounds, there was now a more integrated landscape. Facilities were shared, resources pooled when sensible, yet each trader maintained their distinct identity. The market square buzzed with activity as their ceremonial voyage was welcomed home. Traders, officials, and citizens gathered to hear stories from the journey. Chen Wei spoke of the lessons learned, the harmony achieved, the future being built on foundations of both tradition and innovation. That evening, in his expanded dwelling, Chen Wei sat down to write the final entry in his family's chronicle for that year. By lamplight, with careful brushstrokes on silk, he wrote, "The river teaches that all things flow toward their destiny, but the path is rarely straight. We feared that brutal competition would destroy our way of life. Instead, it transformed us into something stronger, not through victory over opponents but through adaptation that made opposition obsolete. The river trade lives, different than before but more vital, serving not just commercial needs but as a model for how diversity and unity can coexist. To future generations who will read these words, remember, when change comes like a flood, do not try to stand rigid against it nor be swept away entirely. Be like the wise boatman who reads the current and works with it, maintaining his purpose while adapting his methods. The river is eternal, but it is never the same river twice. So too must commerce, and life itself, embrace both continuity and change." Setting down his brush, Chen Wei heard the night sounds of Xianying, distant music, the calls of night watchmen, the eternal murmur of the river. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new lessons. But tonight, there was peace in knowing that the river trade had not just survived but had discovered something precious in its struggle, the wisdom that competition need not mean destruction, that different paths could lead to the same destination, that the brutal forces which threaten to kill can sometimes be the very forces that compel transformation and renewal. The moon rose full over the river, painting its waters silver, the same moon that had watched his ancestors ply these waters, the same moon that would watch future generations continue the eternal dance of commerce and culture, tradition and innovation, the individual and the collective. In the distance, a night bird called, its cry carrying across the water like a blessing, a reminder that life persists, adapts, and thrives, even in the face of the most brutal competition. The river flowed on, patient and eternal, carrying its lessons to all who had the wisdom to listen. As Chen Wei prepared for sleep, he could hear young Zhang in the next room, practicing his calligraphy, writing the characters for harmony, persistence, and wisdom over and over. The boy would carry forward both streams of knowledge, his father's systematic efficiency and Chen Wei's traditional wisdom, creating something new yet rooted in the old. Outside, the river continued its journey to the sea, unchanged in its essence yet ever-changing in its expression, the perfect teacher for those who understood that in commerce, as in life, the greatest strength comes not from rigid power but from flexible adaptation, not from eliminating competition but from transforming it into creative tension that drives innovation while preserving what is essential. The story of the brutal competition that had threatened to kill river trading had become a legend told in markets throughout the empire, not as a tale of victory or defeat, but as a testament to the possibility of transformation, the power of adaptation, and the wisdom of finding harmony in apparent opposition. And so the river trade continued, generation after generation, each facing their own challenges, their own brutal competitions, but armed with the wisdom that survival comes not from strength alone but from the ability to flow like water, persistent, adaptable, and ultimately unstoppable in its patient progress toward its destiny. The last sounds Chen Wei heard as sleep took him were the gentle lapping of water against the dock pilings and the distant rumble of a fully loaded trading vessel setting out on the night tide, carrying goods and ideas, traditions and innovations, the eternal commerce that connected all communities along the great river's path. In dreams, he was young again, standing at the prow of his boat with the whole river stretching before him, full of possibility and promise. But now he understood what his youth had not, that the river's greatest gift was not the wealth it carried but the wisdom it taught, that all things change, that change need not mean loss, and that in flowing with change rather than against it, one finds not just survival but meaning. The brutal competition had not killed the river trader. It had revealed the river trader's immortal spirit, adaptable, resilient, and forever flowing toward tomorrow's distant shore. And so, dear listener, as you drift toward sleep, let the gentle rhythm of the river carry you into peaceful dreams. Remember that even the greatest challenges, the most brutal competitions, can become doorways to transformation. Like the river that flows eternally toward the sea, finding its way around every obstacle, you too possess the wisdom to adapt, survive, and thrive. Let the ancient waters sing you to sleep with their timeless lullaby, knowing that tomorrow's current will carry new opportunities on its eternal flow.